James Carter stood by the large, floor-to-ceiling windows of his office on the 25th floor, his gaze drifting absent-mindedly down to the busy streets of Chicago. As CEO of a successful tech company, his days were usually filled with meetings, decisions, and deadlines, but lately, his attention had been captured by something, or rather, someone else. Every morning for the past few weeks, he'd noticed a woman standing on the corner across from his building, selling flowers. There was nothing particularly unusual about flower vendors in the city, but something about this woman intrigued him. She always seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. James couldn't shake the feeling that he knew her from somewhere, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place where or when. Her long brown hair, pale complexion, and delicate features stirred something deep inside him, a strange familiarity he couldn't ignore. "James, are you even listening?" His business partner, Mark, snapped him out of his reverie. They were supposed to be discussing the launch of a new app, but James's mind had wandered again. "Yeah, sorry. Just distracted," James admitted, trying to focus. He shook his head, forcing himself to return to the present. Mark raised an eyebrow. "You've been staring out that window a lot lately. What's going on?" James hesitated before responding, not quite sure how to explain. "There's this woman, selling flowers across the street. I swear I've seen her before, but I can't figure out where. It's strange." Mark chuckled. "A woman caught your attention? Now that's a first. Why don't you just go talk to her?" "Maybe," James muttered, not ready to admit that the idea had crossed his mind more than once. But something held him back, a feeling he couldn't quite explain, a fear that if he got too close, it might stir up something better left buried. Later that day, as James left the office, he couldn't resist glancing over to where she always stood. Sure enough, she was there, just like every other day. Her clothes were simple, worn from years of use, and her hands moved with a certain grace as she rearranged the flowers on her small cart. But her face was what haunted him. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street, his heart inexplicably racing as he approached her. He was close enough now to see the fine lines of exhaustion under her eyes, the way her lips pressed together in quiet determination. For a moment, she looked up, their eyes meeting for the first time. And in that fleeting second, James felt a jolt of recognition, so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of him. "Hi," he said, his voice sounding unusually tentative. She blinked, as if startled by his sudden presence. "Hi," she replied softly, her voice carrying a hint of weariness. "I see you here every day," James said, struggling to find the right words. "I was wondering if I could buy some flowers?" She nodded, quickly turning to her cart. "What kind of flowers do you need?" James glanced at the assortment in front of him, but found himself unable to focus on the flowers. His mind was racing, his heart pounding as he watched her move. There was something so familiar about the way she handled the blooms, her hands delicate but practiced. "I'll take whatever you recommend," he said, not really caring about the flowers at all. She selected a small bouquet of white lilies and handed them to him. As their hands brushed briefly, James felt another surge of that inexplicable familiarity, but before he could say anything else, she turned her gaze away. "That'll be $10, she said quietly. James handed her a 20, shaking his head when she tried to give him change. "Keep it," he said, his voice soft but firm. For a moment, she hesitated, glancing up at him with a flicker of something in her eyes. Gratitude? Confusion? Pain? It was hard to tell, but whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Thank you," she murmured, pocketing the money and turning back to her cart. James stood there for a few seconds longer, unsure of what else to say. He wanted to ask her name, to understand why he felt such a strong connection to this stranger. But instead, he simply nodded and walked away, the weight of her gaze still heavy on his shoulders. As he crossed the street, he couldn't help but look back one more time. She was already busy with her flowers again, as if their brief interaction had meant nothing. But for James, it meant everything. Something about her was unlocking memories he thought he had long buried. Memories of a time when life was simpler, before tragedy had struck and changed everything. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that this woman was more than just a stranger. She was someone from his past, a past he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. That evening, James sat in his penthouse apartment, staring blankly at the bouquet of white lilies on the table in front of him. The city lights twinkled outside his window, but his mind was miles away, lost in memories he had buried for years. The woman's face, her eyes, that familiar spark. It all felt like a door opening to a past he hadn't dared to revisit. He picked up one of the lilies, twirling it between his fingers as flashes of his childhood flooded back. He had grown up in a small, quiet town, far from the bustling streets of Chicago. His family was comfortable, and his childhood had been happy, filled with simple joys and one person who had meant the world to him. Emily. She had been his best friend, his first love. They had spent summers by the lake, climbed trees, and dreamed of running away together when they grew older. But those dreams had been shattered on a stormy night, when Emily's family was involved in a terrible car accident. Her parents hadn't survived, and after the wreckage, Emily had vanished, disappeared without a trace. James had been told that she was taken in by distant relatives, but no one could ever tell him where. He had searched for her, relentlessly at first, but over time, life had swept him forward, and the pain of losing her had dulled into a quiet ache, buried beneath the demands of his growing empire. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman selling flowers across the street was Emily. He had no proof, no real reason to believe it, but there was something in her eyes, a familiarity that stirred those long dormant memories, bringing them crashing back to the surface. The thought both excited and terrified him. "What are you doing, James?" he muttered to himself, leaning back in his chair. "You're chasing ghosts." But he couldn't let it go. That night, sleep eluded him as he tossed and turned, his mind replaying every encounter with the flower vendor, searching for any clue, any confirmation that she could be Emily. By morning, he had made up his mind. He needed answers. The next day, James stood in his office, peering out the window again. His heart raced as he spotted her, Megan, standing in her usual spot with her small cart of flowers. Today, she seemed more withdrawn, her face tired, her movements slower than usual. Without thinking, James grabbed his coat and headed downstairs. This time, he wouldn't settle for a vague conversation. He needed to know who she was, really was. As he approached her cart, Megan glanced up and gave him a polite smile, the kind you give a familiar stranger. "Back for more flowers?" she asked, her voice soft but distant. James hesitated, his mind racing. How could he approach this without scaring her off? He decided to start with something simple. "You've been out here for a while now," he began, trying to keep his tone casual. "I pass by every day and see you. I guess I'm just curious. What brought you here?" Megan's smile faded slightly, and she looked down at her flowers, her fingers absently arranging them as she thought. "It's just something I do to get by," she said after a moment. "Life's been complicated." James's heart tightened at her words. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him that there was a story behind her guarded demeanor. "I get that," he said softly. "Sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan." Megan nodded, her eyes still focused on the flowers. "No, it doesn't." The silence stretched between them, and James felt the weight of his next question pressing on him. He knew he had to ask, even if it was too soon. "Can I ask you something a little strange?" James began, his voice careful, not wanting to push her away. Megan looked up at him, her brow furrowed slightly in curiosity. "Sure. Your name?" "Megan," James said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "Have you always gone by that name?" Megan blinked, her expression unreadable for a moment. She looked away, the tension between them palpable. "It's the name I use now," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. James felt his pulse quicken. "The name I use now." The words echoed in his mind, confirming his growing suspicion. Did you ever go by another name?" he pressed, trying to keep his voice steady. For a moment, Megan froze, her hands stilling over the flowers. Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but then she closed them, shaking her head slightly. "I don't really like to talk about the past," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's complicated." James knew he was walking on thin ice, but he couldn't stop now. His entire body was tense, waiting for a sign, for something, anything, that would confirm what he already felt in his gut. "I understand," he said softly, "but I can't help feeling like I know you from somewhere, like we've met before." Megan's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Recognition? It was hard to tell, but it was enough for James to know that he wasn't imagining things. She quickly looked away, her hands shaking slightly as she busied herself with the flowers again. "I have to go," she mumbled, stepping back from the cart. "I'm sorry, I need to go." Before James could say another word, Megan grabbed her bag and hurried away, leaving him standing alone on the corner, his mind spinning with more questions than answers. As he watched her disappear into the crowd, one thing became painfully clear. She was hiding something, and James wasn't going to stop until he found out what it was. James couldn't get Megan out of his head, her rushed departure, the fear in her eyes when he'd asked about her name. It was all too familiar. He had been so close to uncovering the truth, but something had spooked her. Now, more than ever, he was convinced that Megan was hiding something significant. He wasn't just imagining the connection between them. There was a history there, a past they shared, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. For the rest of the day, he found himself distracted at work, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the woman on the corner. The conversations, her hesitations, her strange reaction when he brought up her name. It all pointed to something deeper. He needed to find a way to approach her again, but this time, he couldn't push too hard. He had to be careful not to scare her away for good. As evening approached, James decided to take a different route home. He walked down the same street where Megan usually sold her flowers, but tonight, the corner was empty. Her cart was gone, and there was no sign of her anywhere. He felt a pang of disappointment, but also a sense of urgency. What if she wasn't coming back? What if their last conversation had driven her away for good? His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Mark. "Drinks at 7? You look like you could use one." James stared at the message for a moment, then quickly typed back, "Rain check. I've got something I need to take care of." The truth was, he didn't feel like sitting around in a bar. Not with all the questions swirling in his head. He needed to figure out how to get Megan to open up, to trust him. And that meant he had to find her again. The next morning, James woke up earlier than usual, a plan already forming in his mind. He knew Megan often arrived at the corner just before the morning rush, so if he wanted to talk to her without interruptions, this would be his best chance. By 7 a.m., he was standing on the opposite side of the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, watching as Megan arrived with her cart. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders. She seemed more guarded today, her face drawn with tension. James waited for a few moments, giving her time to settle in before crossing the street. He approached her quietly, making sure not to startle her this time. When she finally noticed him, her expression shifted, first surprise, then something like unease. "Good morning," James said, his voice soft but steady. He needed to show her he wasn't a threat. Megan hesitated, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Morning," she replied, her tone wary but polite. "I wanted to apologize," James began, keeping his distance this time. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable yesterday. I guess I got ahead of myself. It wasn't my intention to pry." Megan's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the guarded look never fully left her face. "It's fine," she said quietly. "You didn't do anything wrong. I don't really like talking about the past." James nodded, understanding her reluctance. "I get that. Believe me, I do. But I can't shake this feeling that I know you from somewhere, and I think maybe you feel the same." Megan's eyes darted away, her fingers fidgeting with one of the roses on her cart. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and James wondered if he had pushed too far again. But then, to his surprise, she spoke. "I used to live in a different city," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago. But that part of my life, it's gone now. I had to start over." James's heart raced. This was the closest she had come to acknowledging that there was more to her than she let on. He could sense the pain behind her words, the the burden of whatever she had been through. But there was still a wall between them, and James knew he had to be careful how he proceeded. "I understand," he said gently. "Starting over isn't easy, but you don't have to go through it alone." Megan glanced up at him, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, in her eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. She shook her head, turning back to her flowers. "I'm fine on my own. I've been fine for a long time." James wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. But he held back, sensing that pushing her too hard would only drive her further away. "All right," he said softly, "but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Megan didn't respond, but the way she kept her head down, her fingers still trembling slightly, told James that there was more she wanted to say. She was just too scared to say it. After a moment, James nodded and turned to leave, giving her the space she clearly needed. But as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel that they were closer to something big. He just didn't know what it was yet. That evening, James found himself sitting at his kitchen counter, staring at the bouquet of lilies again. His conversation with Megan replayed in his mind, and the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that she was hiding a much deeper truth. She had lived another life, in another place, and whatever had happened in that life had left scars that still hadn't healed. His phone buzzed again. It was Mark. Still brooding? "Seriously, man, come out for a drink." James smiled faintly at the text, but he wasn't in the mood to explain the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside him. He typed back, "Maybe tomorrow." As he set his phone down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of discovering something important, something that would change everything. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Emily wasn't lost forever. The days that followed felt agonizingly slow. Every morning, James would catch a glimpse of Megan at her flower cart, but their interactions had been reduced to brief exchanges, polite nods, a few words about the weather. It was as if the wall between them had grown thicker, and no matter how carefully he approached, Megan remained guarded, distant. It frustrated him. He knew she was hiding something, and the more she pulled away, the more determined he became to uncover the truth. But he also understood that if he pushed too hard, she might disappear from his life altogether. And that was a risk he wasn't willing to take. By the end of the week, James realized he needed to try something different. A new approach, something that would break through the invisible barrier Megan had built around herself. So, instead of visiting her at the corner like he normally did, he waited. It was a Friday afternoon, and the city was buzzing with its usual rhythm. James stood by the entrance of his office building, watching the people stream by. Megan's cart was visible from where he stood, but he didn't approach. Not yet. At exactly 4 p.m., as the workday began to wind down, James noticed Megan packing up her cart. She moved with the same deliberate care she always did, but there was an air of exhaustion about her, an added weight to her shoulders that hadn't been there before. He wondered what her life was like outside of the few hours she spent selling flowers. Where did she go when she wasn't on that corner? He wasn't going to let the opportunity pass this time. As she locked up her cart and slung her worn-out bag over her shoulder, James crossed the street, timing his approach so that they would meet halfway down the block. "Megan," he called out as he got closer, keeping his tone light, unthreatening. She stopped and looked up, surprised to see him again. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by her usual guarded expression. "Hey," she replied quietly, adjusting the strap of her bag. "I'm just heading home. Mind if I walk with you?" James asked, his voice casual but his heart racing with anticipation. Megan hesitated, glancing around as if looking for an excuse. I usually walk alone." "I understand," James said, keeping his tone gentle, "but it's just a walk. No pressure." She hesitated again but then sighed, nodding slightly. "All right, just for a bit." They started walking side by side down the busy street. The sounds of the city buzzed around them, filling the silence between their steps. James kept his hands in his pockets, resisting the urge to push too hard too soon. "So," he began after a few moments, "you mentioned before that you used to live in another city. Where was that?" Megan's grip on the strap of her bag tightened, and for a second, James thought she wouldn't answer. But then, she spoke, her voice soft and hesitant. "Upstate," she said, not offering more details than that. James nodded, sensing her discomfort. He wasn't going to press her for more, at least, not yet. "Must have been a big change, moving to Chicago," he said, keeping the conversation light. "It was," Megan replied, her eyes focused on the pavement in front of them. "But I needed a fresh start." There it was again, that mention of starting over. James's mind raced with possibilities, but he forced himself to remain patient. He needed her to feel comfortable enough to share more. After a few more blocks, Megan slowed her pace, glancing sideways at James. "Why are you so interested in me?" she asked suddenly, her voice tinged with suspicion. James stopped walking, turning to face her. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to answer. Should he tell her the truth? That he thought she was someone from his past? Someone who had once meant the world to him? Or should he keep playing it safe, keeping his suspicions to himself until he was sure? Taking a deep breath, he chose honesty. "I think I know you," James said, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "I don't know how or why, but ever since I saw you on that corner, I've had this feeling, like we've met before. Like you're someone I used to know." Megan's eyes widened, and she took a small step back, shaking her head. "You don't know me," she said quickly, her voice almost panicked. "You're wrong." "I'm not sure I am," James insisted, his heart pounding in his chest. "There's something about you, Megan. I can't shake the feeling that we're connected somehow." Megan looked down, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the strap of her bag. "You're mistaken," she whispered. "I'm no one." James's heart ached at the pain in her voice. She wasn't just hiding something. She was hiding herself. Whoever Megan really was, she had buried her past deep, and it was tearing her apart. "You're not no one," James said gently, taking a step closer but making sure to keep his distance. "I don't know what happened to you, but I do know this. You don't have to carry it alone." Megan looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, it seemed like she might let her guard down, that she might finally tell him the truth. But then, just as quickly as the vulnerability appeared, it was gone. She blinked, stepping back again and shaking her head. "I can't do this," she muttered, turning away. "I'm sorry, but I can't." "Megan, wait," James started. But she was already walking away, her pace quickening as she disappeared into the crowd. James stood there, watching her retreating figure until she was completely out of sight. His heart sank. He had been so close to breaking through that wall she had built around herself. But just like before, she had shut down, running away from whatever it was that haunted her. He let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair. He knew he couldn't give up, not now. There was too much at stake, too many unanswered questions. Megan was hiding something big, and James wasn't going to stop until he found out what it was. James spent the weekend in a restless haze, replaying the conversation with Megan over and over in his mind. Her reaction had been more telling than any words she'd spoken. The fear, the hesitation, it all pointed to something deeper, something she was desperately trying to hide. And James couldn't shake the feeling that it had everything to do with his past. By Sunday evening, he found himself staring at his laptop, searching through old articles and archives, trying to piece together the fragments of his own memories. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what exactly he was looking for, but he knew there had to be something, some clue that would confirm his suspicions. He typed in the name that had haunted him for years: Emily Rivers. The girl who had disappeared after the accident that had shattered both their lives. He hadn't searched her name in years, but desperation was driving him now. The search results were mostly cold, news reports from over a decade ago, detailing the car crash that had claimed her parents' lives. But as James scrolled through, one headline caught his eye: "Survivor found after tragic accident. Young girl presumed lost." His heart skipped a beat as he clicked on the link, the article from a small-town newspaper flashing onto his screen. The article described how Emily had survived the crash, but had disappeared shortly after being placed in the care of distant relatives. There was no follow-up, no resolution. She had simply vanished. James's eyes narrowed. Could it really be her? Could Megan be Emily, living under a different name, trying to escape her past? It was a wild theory, but it made too much sense to ignore. He sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. If Megan really was Emily, then something terrible must have happened to drive her into hiding. But what? And why hadn't she come to him? They had been everything to each other once. Why would she shut him out now? Monday morning came with a renewed sense of determination. James wasn't going to let this go, not until he had answers. He arrived at his office early, but his mind wasn't on work. He couldn't focus on anything except the possibility that the woman he had loved, the woman he had thought was lost forever, was alive and living right in front of him. By midday, James had made a decision. He needed to confront Megan again, but this time, he had to be more careful. He had to approach her in a way that wouldn't send her running. He spent the next few hours considering his options, knowing that one wrong move could destroy whatever fragile trust they had built. When the clock hit 5, James grabbed his coat and left the office, heading straight for Megan's usual spot on the corner. His heart raced as he crossed the street, but when he reached the corner, he froze. She wasn't there. Her cart, usually filled with vibrant flowers, was missing. Panic rose in his chest. Had she decided to disappear again? Had he scared her off for good? He scanned the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of her somewhere in the crowd, but she was nowhere to be seen. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, frustration bubbling to the surface. Just as he was about to turn and leave, a voice called out from behind him. "Looking for someone?" James spun around to see a young man standing nearby, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. He had seen the guy around before, always lingering near Megan's cart, but James had never paid much attention to him. Now, though, the man's expression was hard to read, somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. "Yeah," James said cautiously. "The woman who usually sells flowers here. Have you seen her today?" The man shrugged. "Megan? Nah, she didn't show up this morning. Not sure why." James's heart sank. "Do you know where she might be?" The man eyed him for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to trust him. "You a friend of hers?" "I'm trying to be," James replied, his voice honest, though tinged with desperation. I need to talk to her." The man studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Look, Megan keeps to herself, okay? She doesn't talk much about her personal life, but she's had a rough time. If I were you, I'd give her some space." James clenched his jaw. "I get that, but it's important." The man nodded slowly, then gestured down the street. "There's a shelter a few blocks away. She crashes there sometimes. Maybe try looking for her there." James's pulse quickened. "Thanks," he said, already turning to leave. "Hey," the man called after him, his voice serious. "Whatever you're looking for, just don't hurt her, okay? She's been through enough." James paused, nodding once before heading down the street. He didn't need to be reminded of how fragile the situation was. He knew that whatever had happened to Megan, whatever she was running from, it had left scars, and he wasn't about to add to them. The shelter was a small, nondescript building nestled between two larger apartment complexes. It wasn't the kind of place James had ever imagined Megan, or Emily, ending up, but as he approached the door, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. What had her life become? How had it come to this? Inside, the shelter was quiet, a few people scattered around the common room, talking in low voices. James approached the front desk, where a tired-looking woman sat, flipping through a stack of paperwork. "Excuse me," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm looking for someone. She might be staying here." The woman glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Name?" "Megan," James said, though the name felt wrong on his tongue. "She sells flowers on the corner near here." The woman frowned, flipping through a small stack of cards. After a moment, she shook her head. "Sorry, we don't have anyone by that name registered here." James felt a wave of disappointment wash over him, but just as he was about to turn and leave, the woman hesitated. "Wait," she said slowly. "There was a woman who came in last night. Didn't give a name, though. Quiet type. Could be the one you're looking for." James's heart leaped. "Is she still here?" The woman shook her head. "Left early this morning." We didn't ask questions. James sighed, frustration bubbling up inside him. He had been so close, but as he turned to leave, the woman called after him one last time. If she comes back, I can give her a message. Anything you want me to tell her? James hesitated, his mind racing. What could he possibly say that would make her come back? After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to the woman. Just tell her James Carter is looking for her. The woman nodded, slipping the card into her desk. I'll let her know. James walked out of the shelter, his mind spinning with more questions than answers. Megan was slipping further away, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold on before she vanished completely. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when he was so close. James couldn't shake the feeling of failure as he left the shelter. Every step felt heavier, the weight of uncertainty dragging him down. He was so close to finding the truth. So close to understanding what had happened to Megan, or Emily, or whoever she really was. But each time, she slipped further away. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. His mind still focused on the conversation he'd just had. She had been there. Megan had been at the shelter, staying in a place he could never have imagined for her. The thought of her living like that, alone, scared, hiding from her past, tightened a knot in his chest. He couldn't rest until he understood why. As he walked back toward his apartment, James finally pulled out his phone to check the message. It was from Mark. You've been MIA. Everything all right? James sighed, typing back a quick response. Not really. I'm close to figuring something out, but it's complicated. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, not in the mood to explain everything. Mark wouldn't understand anyway. He was too practical, too focused on business. To him, James's sudden obsession with Megan would seem irrational, but to James, it was personal, deeply personal. The evening air was cool as he reached his building, and after a quick shower, James sat down in front of his laptop again. The articles about Emily Rivers still filled the screen, the past staring back at him in cold, detached headlines. He scrolled through them, each one recounting the tragedy he already knew by heart. But one detail had always eluded him. Where had Emily gone after the accident? Why had she disappeared? James closed his laptop, rubbing his temples. He had tried to push those memories away for so long, but now they were coming back with a force he couldn't ignore. The girl he had loved, the life they had dreamed of together, the future they had planned. It had all vanished in a single night. And now, years later, he was left chasing shadows, hoping that somehow, against all odds, Emily had survived. He didn't sleep much that night. His dreams were filled with fragmented images, Megan's face blending with Emily's, her eyes filled with the same fear and sadness. He woke up with a start, his heart racing, drenched in a cold sweat. The line between past and present was blurring, and it was driving him mad. The next morning, James was back at the corner where Megan usually set up her cart, but once again, she wasn't there. Frustration gnawed at him, but he wasn't about to give up. Not after everything he had uncovered. He spent the day restless, pacing his office, unable to focus on the work piling up on his desk. His assistant, Jessica, knocked lightly on the door, interrupting his thoughts. James, is everything okay? You've canceled most of your meetings this week, she said, concern evident in her voice. James glanced at her, his mind far from the business world. Yeah, just dealing with something personal. Jessica nodded, sensing that this wasn't a conversation he wanted to have. Let me know if you need anything, she said before slipping out of the room. He appreciated her discretion, but what he really needed was a breakthrough. Later that afternoon, as the city outside his office window bustled with its usual energy, James's phone buzzed. This time, it was a call from a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant but curious, he answered. Hello? A woman's voice came through, soft but steady. Is this James Carter? His pulse quickened. Yes, this is James. This is Susan, from the shelter, the woman on the other end said. You left a message for someone yesterday, Megan? James sat up straighter in his chair. Yes, I did. Have you seen her? There was a brief pause, and James's heart pounded in the silence. She came by earlier today, Susan said finally. I gave her your card. James felt a surge of hope. Did she say anything? Is she all right? She didn't say much, Susan replied. But she did ask if you'd be around this evening. She seemed unsure. James's chest tightened. Megan had taken the card. She had asked about him. It wasn't much, but it was something. He needed to see her, needed to finally get the answers that had been eluding him for so long. Thank you, James said. His voice rushed. I'll head over there now. When James arrived at the shelter, the sky was a dull gray, clouds heavy with the threat of rain. He pushed open the door, the familiar scent of stale air and worn-out furniture hitting him as he stepped inside. Susan greeted him with a nod. She's in the back, she said quietly. I'll give you some privacy. James nodded gratefully and walked down the narrow hallway toward the back room. His heart was racing, his hands clammy with anticipation. What would he say? How could he approach this without scaring her away again? As he reached the doorway, he saw Megan sitting in a chair, her head down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than before, as if the weight of her secrets was crushing her. But when she looked up and saw him, her expression softened, just for a moment. You came, she said quietly. James stepped into the room, his voice gentle. Of course I did. I told you I wouldn't give up. Megan looked away, her fingers twisting in her lap. I don't know why you care so much. Because I need to understand, James said, moving closer but keeping his distance, giving her space. I know you're hiding something, Megan. I know there's more to your story than you're telling me. And I think it has something to do with me. She stiffened at his words, her eyes darting up to meet his. For a moment, she looked like she might run again. But then something shifted. Her shoulders sagged, and she let out a long, shaky breath. I'm not who you think I am, she whispered, her voice barely audible. James's heart pounded in his chest. Then tell me who you are. Please. Megan closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she struggled to find the words. I was someone else a long time ago. Someone who lost everything. And when that happened, I couldn't be her anymore. I had to become someone else. James felt the air leave his lungs. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The truth he had been chasing for weeks, years even. Emily, he said softly, the name hanging in the air between them like a fragile thread. Megan, Emily, flinched at the sound of her real name, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she opened her eyes, tears pooling at the corners. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if I could. James sank into the chair opposite her, his mind spinning. After all these years, after thinking she was gone forever, she was sitting right in front of him. But the woman in front of him wasn't the girl he had known. She was different, damaged, scared, and hiding behind a new identity. Why didn't you come to me? James asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you tell me you were alive? Emily's tears spilled over, her voice cracking as she spoke. I couldn't. I didn't want you to see what I had become. I wasn't the same person anymore, James. After the accident, after losing my family, I didn't know who I was. James reached out, his hand hovering near hers, but not quite touching. You could have told me. We could have faced it together. She shook her head. No, you don't understand. I couldn't bring you into the mess my life became. I thought I was protecting you. James felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He had spent years grieving for her, blaming himself for not being able to save her, only to find out she had been carrying the same pain all along. I never needed protection from you, James said softly. I just needed you. Emily's breath hitched, and for the first time since he had found her, she looked at him, really looked at him. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, recognition, maybe even hope, but it was fleeting. I don't know if I can be that person again, she whispered. James's heart ached, but he wasn't about to give up now. Then we'll figure it out together. But I'm not letting you disappear again. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them spoke. The air between James and Emily was thick with unspoken emotions, years of separation and heartache hanging between them like an invisible barrier. James had dreamed of this moment for so long, But now that it was happening, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and everything could come crashing down. Emily was the first to break the silence, her voice raw and broken. "I don't know how to be the person you remember, James. That girl, she died in that accident." James felt the weight of her words like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on finding her, on proving that she was still alive, that he hadn't stopped to consider what kind of life she had been living in the years since the accident. He could see it now, the trauma, the fear, the survival instincts that had forced her to bury Emily Rivers and become Megan, a woman who didn't look back. But he couldn't let her believe that she was lost forever. He had to make her understand that the past didn't have to define who she was now. "You didn't die, Emily," James said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You survived, and that means something. You can't erase what happened, but you're still here. You're still you." Emily shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I'm not, James. You're holding on to an idea of me that doesn't exist anymore. I've spent years trying to forget who I was, trying to move on, but every time I get close to feeling normal, the past drags me back." James could see the walls she had built around herself, walls made of fear, shame, and guilt. He knew she was terrified of letting anyone, especially him, see how much she had been through. But he wasn't going to let her face it alone. He leaned forward, his gaze intense but soft. "I don't care if you're not the same person you were back then. None of us are. But you don't have to carry this by yourself. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, and for a moment, James thought she might let him in. But then, just as quickly, she pulled back, her expression hardening. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't just lose my family in that accident. I lost everything. After the crash, I had no one. No home, no future. I was thrown into a system that didn't care about me. I had to start over from scratch, and it wasn't easy." James's heart clenched. He had always assumed that Emily had been taken in by relatives, that she had at least been cared for, even if they had been separated. But hearing the truth now, knowing that she had been left to fend for herself, broke something inside him. "I'm so sorry," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea. I thought they took care of you." "They didn't," Emily said bitterly. "I was passed around, forgotten. And when I turned 18, I left. I had nothing, no one. I became someone else because I couldn't survive as Emily Rivers anymore." James stared at her, his mind reeling from the enormity of what she had been through. He had spent years grieving for the girl he had lost, but now he realized that Emily had been grieving too, for the life she had once known, for the family she had lost, for the version of herself that had been left behind in the wreckage. "Emily," James said softly, reaching out to take her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. "You don't have to be that person anymore. You don't have to keep running. Let me help you. Let's figure this out together." Her hand trembled in his, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything. James could see the internal battle playing out on her face, the fear of letting someone in, the fear of being vulnerable again. But there was also a flicker of hope, a glimmer of the connection they had once shared. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can do this." James squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to do it alone." The next few days were tentative, fragile. Emily, still hesitant to reclaim her old name, was slowly opening up to James, but the years of separation had left deep scars. James understood that healing wouldn't come overnight, and he was careful not to push her too hard. They met in quiet places, coffee shops tucked away from the busy streets, parks where they could talk without being disturbed. Emily had kept so much of her life hidden for so long that it was difficult for her to share the details of what had happened after the accident. But little by little, she started to let the walls down. She told James about the years she spent drifting from place to place, trying to escape the pain of her past, trying to build a life for herself when she had nothing. "I felt like a ghost," she confessed one evening, as they sat on a park bench under the soft glow of the setting sun. "Like I didn't exist anymore. I wasn't Emily Rivers, but I didn't know who Megan was either. I was just surviving." James listened quietly, his heart aching for everything she had endured. He wished he could go back in time, find her sooner, save her from the years of suffering she had gone through. But he knew that all he could do now was be there for her in the present. "You deserve more than just surviving," James said softly. "You deserve to live, Emily. To be happy again." Emily looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. "I don't even know what that feels like anymore." James wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, that they could rebuild their lives together, but he knew better than to offer empty reassurances. The road ahead of them was still uncertain, and there were no guarantees. But he was willing to fight for her, for them. "Then we'll figure it out," James said gently, "one step at a time." As the days passed, the bond between them slowly began to heal. Emily was still guarded, still unsure of who she was or where she fit in the world. But James could see glimpses of the girl he had once known. The way she smiled, the way her eyes softened when she talked about the things she used to love. It was all still there, buried beneath the layers of pain. But the past wasn't done with them yet. One evening, as James and Emily were walking back from dinner, the quiet peace they had found together was shattered. A figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. "Emily?" The voice was low, rough, and instantly familiar to James. Emily froze, her hand tightening around James's arm. The color drained from her face as she stared at the man in front of them, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "Emily, it's really you," the man said, stepping closer. "I've been looking for you for years." James felt his heart drop. He didn't know who this man was, but the look on Emily's face told him everything he needed to know. Her past had finally caught up with her. James felt the tension in the air tighten like a vice. He could see the fear etched on Emily's face, her eyes wide as she stared at the man standing in front of them. The man's voice, low and rough, sent a shiver down James's spine. He didn't know who this person was, but one thing was clear. Emily recognized him, and whatever history they shared, it was enough to send her into a state of shock. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The city buzzed around them, the distant sounds of traffic and conversation filling the space. But it all felt far away. All James could focus on was Emily's grip on his arm, tightening as though she were trying to anchor herself, as though she might collapse if she didn't hold on. "Emily," the man repeated, his tone softer this time, almost pleading. "It's really you." She shook her head, barely able to form words. I thought I'd never see you again." James felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him, but he kept his voice calm. "Who are you?" he asked, stepping slightly in front of Emily as if to shield her. The man shifted his gaze to James, his eyes narrowing for a brief moment before he answered. "I'm Kyle," he said flatly. "We were close a long time ago, back when she was still Emily." James could feel Emily tense beside him, but she didn't say anything. Her silence was louder than words, confirming that there was more to this story than he had known. He wanted to ask her about it, but now wasn't the time. "What do you want?" James pressed, keeping his tone firm but controlled. The last thing he wanted was to provoke a confrontation, but he needed to know why this man had suddenly appeared after all these years. Kyle's expression softened, his gaze shifting back to Emily. "I've been looking for you for so long," he said quietly. "After everything that happened, I didn't know where you went. I thought you were dead." Emily's breath hitched, and James could feel the wave of emotion radiating from her. Her past, which she had tried so hard to escape, had come crashing back into her life, and there was no avoiding it now. "I wasn't dead," Emily said, her voice shaky but clear. "I was just gone." Kyle took a step closer, his eyes searching hers for answers. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you disappear?" James could feel the tension building, the questions hanging in the air like a storm about to break. He wanted to intervene, to pull Emily away from this, but he knew she needed to confront it, needed to face the past if they were ever going to move forward. Emily exhaled shakily, finally meeting Kyle's gaze. "Because I couldn't handle it. After the accident, after losing everything, I couldn't be that person anymore. I had to leave. I had to disappear." Kyle's face tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "You didn't have to go through it alone. You didn't have to run." I didn't know what else to do. Emily's voice rose, the years of pent-up pain and frustration finally spilling over. I was scared. I was lost. I couldn't face it. Not with you. Not with anyone. James stood silently beside her, his heart breaking for her as she unleashed the truth. He had known that Emily had suffered, but hearing it now, hearing her voice tremble as she relived those painful memories, made the weight of it all hit even harder. Kyle's expression softened, his anger fading into something more vulnerable. I was looking for you, Em. I tried to find you, but you were gone. You left me behind. Emily's face crumpled as she struggled to hold back tears. I didn't leave you because I wanted to. I left because I couldn't stay. I was broken. I still am. James stepped closer to her, his hand finding hers. She squeezed it tightly, drawing strength from his presence. He could feel the depth of her turmoil, the weight of her past pressing down on her, but he wasn't going to let her face it alone anymore. Kyle looked between them, his eyes lingering on their intertwined hands. "And now," he asked, his voice tinged with sadness, "are you going to run again?" Emily swallowed hard, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "I'm tired of running." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. For the first time in years, Emily was choosing to face her past instead of running from it. But as much as James felt relief, he could see that Kyle wasn't ready to let go so easily. "There's so much you don't know," Kyle said, his voice low. "So much I've been through since you left." Emily hesitated, her eyes full of guilt. "I'm sorry, Kyle. I'm sorry for everything. But I can't go back. I can't undo the choices I made." Kyle's face hardened again, his hands curling into fists. "You left me with nothing," he said through gritted teeth. "Do you have any idea what it was like for me? To lose you like that? To think you were dead?" James stepped forward, his patience thinning. "This isn't helping anyone," he said firmly. "Emily's trying to move forward. We all are." Kyle's eyes flashed with anger, but then he looked at Emily, and the fire in his expression dulled. "I just need to understand," he said, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you tell me you were alive?" Emily let out a shaky breath, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "Because I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want anyone to. I wasn't the girl you knew anymore. I was a mess. And I thought it would be better if you just moved on." Kyle stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched tight. Then, with a bitter laugh, he shook his head. "Moved on? Do you really think I could just move on after losing you?" Emily's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't look away. "I'm sorry, Kyle," she whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know how to survive any other way." There was a long silence. Kyle looked like he wanted to say more, to argue, to demand something, anything that would make this all make sense. But there were no easy answers, no quick fixes for the years of pain and separation. Finally, Kyle took a step back, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I don't even know what to say," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "I spent all this time looking for you, and now that I've found you, it feels like I lost you all over again." Emily's voice was soft but steady. "I'm not the person you were looking for, Kyle. I'm sorry, but I hope you can find peace. I hope you can move forward, too." Kyle met her eyes one last time, the rawness of his emotions on full display. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows from which he had come. For a moment, James and Emily stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Emily's hand was still gripping his, her knuckles white, but she didn't move, didn't speak. James turned to her, his voice gentle. "Are you okay?" She let out a shaky breath, her eyes still fixed on the spot where Kyle had vanished. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "It's like a part of my past I thought I'd buried just came back to life, and I don't know how to feel about it." James squeezed her hand, offering her the only thing he could, his presence. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "We'll take it one step at a time." Emily finally looked up at him, her eyes red but full of resolve. "I'm done running, James," she said, her voice stronger now. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it. With you. James felt a surge of relief and something deeper. Hope. We'll face it together, he promised, pulling her into his arms. And for the first time in years, Emily felt like she wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed Kyle's unexpected appearance were a blur of emotions. Emily found herself drifting between relief, guilt, and a strange sense of closure. She had spent so many years running from the past, and now, for the first time, she had faced it head-on. The weight she had carried for so long had begun to lift, but the scars remained, raw and tender. James had stayed by her side through it all. He didn't push her to talk about what had happened with Kyle, but his quiet presence was enough to keep her grounded. Every day, he showed her that she wasn't alone anymore, that she didn't have to face the darkness of her past on her own. But there were still moments when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm her. One afternoon, as they sat together in his apartment, Emily stared out the window, watching the city move below them. James was sitting next to her, his hand resting on her knee, his touch reassuring and constant. "Do you think he's really gone?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. James turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. "Kyle?" Emily nodded, her gaze still distant. "I thought I had buried that part of my life for good, but now, seeing him, it feels like it's all coming back." James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "He might be gone, but that doesn't mean the past is. We can't erase it, but we can face it together. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Emily closed her eyes, the truth of his words settling over her. She had spent so many years trying to bury her past, believing that if she ignored it long enough, it would disappear. But that had only left her feeling empty and disconnected, living as a shadow of who she used to be. Now, with James by her side, she was starting to see that facing her past didn't mean she had to lose herself again. "I'm just so tired, James," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Tired of being scared. Tired of feeling like I don't belong anywhere." James's grip on her knee tightened, his voice soft but firm. "You do belong. You belong with me. We can build a new life together, Emily. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it can be real." She turned to face him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness again, that she could rebuild her life with James, not as the broken girl she had been, but as the woman she was becoming. "I want that," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want to try." James smiled, his eyes full of warmth and understanding. "We'll take it one day at a time, whatever it takes." The days turned into weeks, and Emily began to rebuild her life, piece by piece. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when the nightmares returned, memories of the accident, and the years of pain that followed haunting her in the darkness. But every morning, when she woke up, James was there. His presence, steady and unwavering, became her anchor. They spent more time together, gradually opening up about their lives. James shared stories from the years they had been apart, the business he had built, the people he had met. Emily, in turn, revealed more of the years she had spent drifting, the jobs she had taken to survive, and the loneliness that had followed her everywhere she went. One evening, as they sat on the couch in James's living room, Emily found herself telling him about the foster homes she had lived in after the accident. The memories were painful, but sharing them with James made them feel less overwhelming, as if speaking the words aloud helped her release the grip they had on her. "I didn't belong anywhere," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "I was just this lost kid, shuffled from one home to the next. No one really cared where I ended up. I was just another name on a list." James reached out, covering her hand with his. "You're not just a name on a list anymore, Emily. You matter. To me." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. For so long, she had felt like she was invisible, like her existence didn't matter to anyone. But now, with James by her side, she was starting to believe that she was worth more than her past, that she had a future worth fighting for. One morning, about a month after Kyle's sudden appearance, Emily and James took a walk through the park where they had spent so many quiet evenings talking. The sun was warm on their faces, and the sound of children playing in the distance filled the air with a sense of normalcy. Emily had come to treasure these moments of peace. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with her. She was learning to live in the present, and with James's support, she was beginning to imagine a future. But as they sat on a bench, watching the world go by, Emily felt a familiar knot of uncertainty twist in her stomach. She turned to James, her voice hesitant. "Do you ever think about the future? About us?" James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about what it could be like. I think about you, about us building something together. But I don't want to rush you, Emily. I know you're still figuring things out." Emily nodded, her mind racing. She had been so focused on surviving, on dealing with the immediate pain of her past, that she hadn't allowed herself to truly consider what came next. But now, sitting here with James, the idea of a future with him didn't feel so far-fetched. It felt possible. "I'm not sure what the future looks like," she said slowly, "but I know I don't want to face it alone." James smiled, a look of quiet determination in his eyes. "You won't have to." There was a long pause, the moment between them filled with unspoken promises. Emily had been so used to running, so used to hiding, that the idea of building a life with someone, of being vulnerable again, terrified her. But with James, it felt different. It felt safe. "Do you think it's possible?" she asked quietly. "Do you think we can really make it work?" James reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I know we can," he said firmly, "because we're not the same people we were all those years ago. We've been through hell and back, but we're still here. And as long as we're in this together, we can face whatever comes next." Emily smiled, a small but genuine smile that felt like the first glimmer of hope in a long, long time. "Together," she repeated softly. James leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Together." That night, as they lay in bed, Emily felt a sense of calm settle over her. The fear that had once controlled her life was still there, but it no longer consumed her. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. For the first time in years, she felt like she had found a place where she belonged. And that place was with James. But deep down, she knew that there were still challenges ahead. There were still wounds that hadn't fully healed, shadows of the past that lingered in the corners of her mind. But for the first time, she felt like she had the strength to face them, because she wasn't alone anymore. And no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it. The next few weeks passed like a dream, but for Emily, it was a fragile dream. One she was afraid might shatter if she let herself believe in it too much. Every morning, she woke up next to James, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her past begin to lift. It wasn't gone. Some days, the memories still crept in, uninvited and painful, but she no longer faced them alone. James had become her constant, her steady ground in a world that had once felt so unstable. His presence in her life was a reminder that she wasn't the girl she used to be. She was stronger now, more resilient. But despite the progress she had made, a lingering fear remained, the fear of losing it all again. One evening, after a quiet dinner at James's apartment, they sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Emily leaned into James's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his arm around her. There was a peace in the air that she had come to treasure. "I've been thinking," Emily began softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "about everything that's happened. About us." James turned to her, his expression attentive and calm. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I've spent so long being afraid of what's next, afraid of what's going to happen if I let myself believe that we could actually work." James's eyes softened. "Emily, I know this hasn't been easy for you, but you don't have to be afraid anymore. We're in this together, and whatever happens, we'll face it." Emily nodded, grateful for his reassurance, but there was something deeper that she needed to say. "I know, but I think it's time for me to stop being afraid of the future. It's time for me to stop letting the past control me." James smiled gently, his hand finding hers. "You've come a long way, Emily. You should be proud of that." She smiled, but it was tinged with the weight of everything she had been through. I am. But there's one more thing I need to do. James's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity in his eyes. What is it? Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she was about to say. I need to go back. I need to go back to the town where it all happened, where I lost everything. James's grip on her hand tightened, his expression serious. Are you sure? You don't have to do this if you're not ready. I am ready, Emily said, her voice firmer now. I need to face it. I need to see where my life changed, where everything fell apart. Because if I don't think I can ever really move on. James studied her for a long moment, his eyes filled with concern but also admiration. He knew how much this meant to her, how important it was for her healing, and he knew she was strong enough to face it. Then I'll go with you, he said, his voice steady and sure. Emily looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. You don't have to. I want to, James interrupted gently. I want to be there with you. For every part of this. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of love. She nodded, unable to find the words to express how much his support meant to her. A week later, they were driving upstate, the familiar countryside rolling past the windows as they neared the town where Emily had grown up. It had been years since she had set foot there, and as they approached, a flood of memories washed over her. Some good, but most of them painful. James glanced at her as they drove into the town, his hand resting on the steering wheel, his expression calm but watchful. He knew this wasn't easy for her, and he was prepared to follow her lead. However she chose to face what was coming. They pulled into a quiet street lined with old, familiar houses. The neighborhood had barely changed since the last time she had seen it, and yet everything felt different. It was smaller than she remembered, more subdued, as if the weight of her memories had made it larger in her mind. They parked outside what had once been her childhood home. The house looked exactly the same, its white paint slightly chipped, the yard still dotted with the same trees she used to climb as a child. Emily stared at it for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. This is it, she whispered. James nodded, his hand gently finding hers. Take your time. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the past heavy in the air. Emily's mind raced with memories of her parents, the life she had lost, and the girl she had once been. But instead of running from it, she let herself feel it, let herself confront the pain head-on. I used to think that this place was where my life ended, Emily said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. That everything good I had was gone the moment I lost my family. For so long, I believed that nothing good could come after that. James stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air, his hand gently resting on hers as a quiet reassurance. He knew how important this moment was for her, how much it took for her to confront the past she had spent so long avoiding. But now, Emily continued, her gaze still fixed on the house, I'm starting to realize that this place isn't the end of my story. It's just a part of it. A painful part, but not the only part. She turned to look at James then, her eyes shimmering with tears that she didn't try to hold back this time. Meeting you again, finding you after all these years, it showed me that there's more to my life than just loss, that I can build something new, that I can be whole again. James felt a lump form in his throat, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. He had seen her struggle, seen her carry the burden of her past for so long, and now, standing here in the place where her life had changed forever, he could see that she was ready to let go, to heal, to move forward. Emily, he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction, you're not defined by what happened here. You've survived more than most people could even imagine, and you're still standing. And now, you don't have to do it alone. Emily let out a shaky breath, the tears finally spilling over as she nodded. I know, and that's why I'm ready. I'm ready to let go of the fear, the guilt, all of it. She reached out, taking James's hand in hers, her grip strong and certain. I want to live, James. Really live. Not just survive. James smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love for her. Then let's do it, he said, squeezing her hand. Let's live. The sun was beginning to set as they left the neighborhood, the orange and pink hues casting a warm glow over the town that had once been the source of so much pain for Emily. But now, as they drove away, she felt lighter, as if the weight she had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. They didn't need to say much as they drove back. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were no longer bound by the past. They were free to move forward, together. When they returned to the city, Emily knew that this was just the beginning. There would still be hard days, still moments when the memories resurfaced, but now, for the first time, she felt like she had the strength to face them. And more importantly, she had James by her side. A few months later, on a quiet evening, James and Emily sat together on the same balcony where they had shared so many of their conversations. The city sprawled out below them, alive with its usual hum of activity, but up here, everything felt peaceful, almost like they were in their own little world. Emily leaned back against James, his arms wrapped around her as they looked out at the lights. There was a sense of calm between them now, a quiet contentment that came from knowing they had faced the worst together and come out the other side. "Do you ever think about the future?" Emily asked, echoing the question she had asked him months ago. But this time, there was no hesitation in her voice, only hope. James smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I think about it all the time." Emily smiled too, her heart full of something she hadn't felt in a long time, certainty. "Me too," she said softly, "and for the first time, I'm not afraid of it." They sat there together, the future stretching out before them, full of possibility. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, Emily knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because this was just the beginning.